Good evening to the night owls. Good afternoon to the day walkers. And good morning to the rising dead. Welcome to Classified Culture. If you enjoy science fiction and horror stories, then you've come to the right channel. Our goal is to provide quality and original stories for listeners on a regular basis. Every day there will be at least one or two new stories for your listening pleasure. Help this channel grow as a community. You can help by sharing this video, giving it a like, leaving a message in the comments section, and subscribing to the channel. Your feedback and support is always appreciated. Well, I suppose that's enough said for now. It's time for me to do what you all have been waiting for. It's time to let the words I speak guide your imagination with a dark and twisted tale. In the hushed twilight of the suburban home, Dr. Amelia Hart found herself standing in a room she hadn't entered before. Yet here she was, the faint scent of rust tickling her nostrils like an unwelcome whisper. The walls were bare, save for a single dried bloodstain near the ceiling, a crimson exclamation mark against the pristine white paint. It wasn't fresh. It had been there long enough to darken and crackle at its edges like ancient parchment. Amelia's breath hitched in her throat, catching on a sudden knot of dread. She stepped closer, reaching out a tentative hand towards the stain. Her fingers tingled with an urge to touch it, to confirm its reality. But before she could make contact, something shifted beneath her feet. The floorboards groaned, and the bloodstain seemed to pulse, throbbing like a heartbeat echoing through the walls. Her breath turned wet and uneven, each inhale dragging against her throat as if her lungs were filling with fluid. Panic surged, but she fought it down, grasping onto logic like a lifeline. This was just an old house, settling in its age. Nothing more. But the sensation persisted, her chest growing heavier with each breath until it felt like she was drowning in air. She gasped, struggling to draw even the smallest sip of oxygen. Her heart pounded wildly, a drumbeat reverberating through her ribcage and echoing in her ears. Her body refused to listen to reason. It propelled her forward, hands reaching out instinctively to brace against walls that seemed to sway around her. The house was breathing too, its ancient bones creaking with each labored breath they took together. She stumbled into the next room, collapsing onto her knees. The floor here was damp, cold seeping through her trousers like a chill touch from below. She looked down at her hands, now splayed out before her, and saw they were coated in a thin sheen of sweat. Or so she thought, until she brought them closer to her face and caught the metallic tang of blood. Her stomach churned violently, threatening to empty its contents onto the floor. But she couldn't move, couldn't push herself away from the ground. Her body betrayed her, remaining frozen in place even as her mind screamed at it to flee. Then came the sound. A soft, wet dragging noise emanating from behind the walls. It echoed around her, impossible to pinpoint its exact origin. With each pass of whatever was making that sound, the walls seemed to grow closer, their shadows stretching out like reaching fingers. Amelia's mind raced, trying desperately to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't supposed to be real. It couldn't be. She had come here to debunk a rumor, not to validate it. But as she listened to that wet dragging noise growing louder, more insistent, she felt something else rising within her. A sensation she'd never experienced before, but recognized instantly nonetheless. The primal terror of being hunted. Not just by anything, but by something that was already inside her head, burrowing deeper with each passing moment. Her heart pounded frantically, a trapped animal thrashing against its cage. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each one tearing at her throat like jagged glass. She tried to move again, to push herself away from the floor, but her limbs refused to obey. They twitched and spasmed beneath her, betraying her attempts at control. And then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The dragging noise ceased abruptly, leaving behind a deafening silence that seemed to press against her eardrums like physical weight. Her breath caught in her throat, held captive along with the rest of her body. In that moment of utter stillness, Amelia felt something else shift inside her. A subtle rearrangement of perceptions, like pieces on a chessboard moving into new positions without her knowledge or consent. She blinked, disoriented, trying to understand what had just happened. But when she opened her eyes again, she found herself staring up at the ceiling from a different angle entirely. Her body remained frozen in place, but now it was stretched out flat on the floor. And above her, looming large and menacing, was a single word carved into the plaster: "Stay." She swallowed hard, the movement sending waves of pain through her throat. She tried to tell herself it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps some cruel prank played by whoever had left that dried bloodstain behind. But deep down, where reason struggled against primal instinct, she knew better. This wasn't right. None of this was right. And now, even her own body seemed to be conspiring against her, keeping her rooted here, while something else moved unseen through the walls. With a groan that echoed like a protest from her very soul, Amelia dragged herself back to her feet. Her limbs trembled with exertion, each movement sending jolts of pain up her spine. But she refused to give in, refused to let this house, this thing, win. She took one last look around the room before leaving, her gaze lingering on that single word carved into the ceiling: "Stay." Then, with grim determination etched onto every line of her face, Amelia Hart stepped out into the hall once more, ready to face whatever horrors lay waiting in the shadows ahead. Amelia stood there for a moment, her breath ragged, eyes fixed on that single word carved into the ceiling. Stay. The air felt thick, heavy with an unseen presence, pressing down on her like a physical weight. She could almost feel it, like a hand at her back, pushing her towards the door, urging her to leave. But she wouldn't. Not until she understood what was happening here. With a shuddering breath, Amelia turned away from the ceiling and stepped out into the hallway. The wet dragging sound had stopped, but its absence seemed even more ominous than before. It was as if whatever made that noise was now watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. The house was silent, except for the distant ticking of clocks running backward in time. Amelia could feel each second stretching out, taut and brittle, threatening to snap at any moment. She took a step forward, then another, moving slowly down the hall towards the unexplored room she'd seen earlier. The floorboards creaked underfoot, each sound echoing like a gunshot in her ears. As she approached the doorway, Amelia noticed something strange about the light. It seemed to flicker and dance, casting shadows that moved independently of her own movements. She reached out tentatively, fingers brushing against the doorframe. The wood felt damp, slick with moisture that wasn't there before. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped inside, eyes scanning the room for any sign of what might have made that horrifying noise. At first glance, everything seemed normal. A bed pushed against one wall, a dresser against another, a wardrobe standing tall and imposing in the corner. But then she noticed it. The bed sheets were stained dark with blood, like someone had been sleeping there when they were attacked. Amelia approached cautiously, each step feeling heavier than the last. She could hear her own heartbeat now, a steady thrum in her ears that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the house itself. As she reached out to touch the bloodstain on the sheets, she felt something shift beneath her fingers, a wet, slippery movement that made bile rise in her throat. She yanked her hand back, eyes widening, as she watched the bloodstain spread across the sheet like ink dropped into water. It moved too quickly, too eagerly, as if hungry for more surface area to consume. Amelia stumbled backwards, horror rooting her feet to the floor as she realized this wasn't just dried blood anymore. It was fresh. A wet dragging sound echoed through the walls again, louder than before. This time, however, it seemed to be coming from behind her. She whirled around, breath catching in her throat as she saw the wardrobe door slowly creaking open. The sound grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with its sickening rhythm. Amelia's body refused to move. It was as if her muscles had turned to stone, frozen in place by sheer terror. She could only watch helplessly as the wardrobe door swung fully open, revealing nothing but empty darkness within. And then, something moved. A form emerged from the shadows, slow and deliberate like a predator stalking its prey. It was humanoid in shape, but twisted somehow, limbs too long, joints bent at unnatural angles. Amelia could hear bones popping softly as it stepped into the light, each sound sending a jolt of terror through her veins. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized what was happening. Her fingers were bending backwards, soft internal pops echoing in time with the creature's movements. She tried to scream, but all that came out was a strangled gasp, barely audible even to herself. The creature stepped closer, its face still hidden by shadows. Amelia could feel its breath now, wet and hot against her skin, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else. Something familiar. It took another step forward, and she finally saw what lurked beneath those shadows, a reflection of her own face, twisted into something monstrous. Panic surged through her like wildfire, drowning out all rational thought. She stumbled backwards, hands flailing wildly as she tried to put distance between herself and this abomination. But it was too late. The creature lunged forward, fingers curling around her wrists with surprising strength. Amelia felt something snap inside her then, some vital connection between mind and body severed irrevocably. Her limbs twitched and spasmed, betraying her attempts at control as she struggled against the creature's grip. Its nails dug into her skin, drawing blood that stained its fingers red before dripping onto the floorboards beneath them. The dragging noise grew louder still, resonating within Amelia's very bones until it felt like her heart was beating in time with that sickening rhythm. She could feel something changing inside her too, her perceptions shifting, rearranging themselves into new patterns she didn't understand or want to acknowledge. And then, suddenly, everything went black. When Amelia came to, she found herself lying on the floor once more, but this time there was no pain, no panic surging through her veins. Instead, she felt calm. Too calm, as if something had been taken from her instead of given. She pushed herself up slowly, eyes scanning the room for any sign of the creature. But it was gone, melted back into the shadows from whence it came. In its place was a single object lying on the bedsheet, a tooth gleaming white against the dark stain of blood. Amelia's hand trembled as she reached out to pick it up, running her thumb along its smooth surface. It felt real enough, but there was something else too. An echo of memory clinging to it like cobwebs. A recollection of teeth sinking into flesh, of hot blood filling her mouth. She shook her head sharply, trying to dislodge the thought before it could take root. This wasn't right. None of this was right. And now, even her own memories seemed unreliable, twisted by whatever force dwelled within these walls. With a shuddering breath, Amelia rose to her feet once more. She clutched the tooth tightly in one hand, using it as an anchor amidst the swirling chaos. Then, with grim determination etched onto every line of her face, she stepped out into the hall again, ready to face whatever horrors lay waiting in the shadows ahead. But first, she had to find a way out of this house, before it was too late. Amelia's breath came in ragged gasps as she staggered out of the room, the tooth still clutched tightly in her hand, like a talisman against evil. Her heart pounded relentlessly against her ribcage, each beat echoing through every fiber of her being, yet it felt distant somehow, detached from the rest of her. She could feel the creature's touch lingering on her skin, its nails still digging into her wrists even though she was free. She leaned against the wall for support, sliding down until she was sitting on the floorboards, knees drawn up to her chest. The house seemed unnaturally quiet now, as if holding its breath along with Amelia. But there was no relief in this silence. Instead, it felt heavy and oppressive, pressing down upon her shoulders like a physical weight. Her eyes drifted closed involuntarily, and she found herself back in that wardrobe once more, the creature's elongated limbs reaching out for her, its teeth glinting menacingly. She snapped them open again with a shuddering breath, but the memory lingered, burning itself into her mind like an acid-etched tattoo. With considerable effort, Amelia pushed herself back onto her feet. Her body felt alien somehow, disconnected from her commands. It was as if someone else had control now, guiding her movements against her will. She stumbled down the hallway, fingers trailing along the wallpaper for balance. The patterns seemed to writhe beneath her touch, twisting into grotesque caricatures before returning to their original design when she looked directly at them. A door loomed ahead, sealed shut with heavy layers of dust and cobwebs. Yet, despite its apparent disuse, Amelia could have sworn she heard something moving within, a faint dragging sound that set her teeth on edge. She reached out tentatively, turning the handle slowly as if expecting it to burn her flesh. It creaked open reluctantly, revealing another bedroom. But this one was different. The bed sheets were stained dark with blood, dried but still sticky to the touch. Amelia approached cautiously, her footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. She could almost hear the house breathing around her, its inhalations and exhalations synchronized perfectly with hers. It felt like being inside a living organism, one that was watching her intently, waiting for her next move. She reached out towards the sheets, fingers hovering millimeters above their surface before touching down gently. They felt cold and stiff beneath her fingertips, yet there was something else too, a faint warmth pulsing deep within them, like a heartbeat. She snatched her hand away as if burned, wiping it on her jeans until the sensation faded completely. Her eyes scanned the room, coming to rest on the window. It was boarded up tightly from the outside, yet sunlight streamed through gaps around the edges, casting long shadows across the floorboards. As Amelia stepped closer, she noticed something else, teeth marks etched into the wood surrounding the frame. Dozens of them, all perfectly aligned as if they'd been carved deliberately rather than randomly. She leaned in for a closer look, squinting at the tiny imperfections that marred each indentation. They seemed familiar somehow, yet she couldn't quite place why. Then it hit her. They were identical to the tooth she still clutched tightly in her hand. The same size, shape, even the slight curve of each edge was eerily similar. A shiver ran down Amelia's spine at the realization. This wasn't just some random collection of teeth. It was a record, a timeline etched into wood by something that wanted, no, needed, to remember. But what were they remembering? And why? She took another step forward, reaching out to trace the marks with her fingertip. As she did so, she noticed something else. Blood already dried in places no one had entered yet. It coated the windowsill, spattered across the wallpaper, even pooled on the floorboards beneath the window itself. Yet, there was no body, no sign of struggle or forced entry. It was as if whoever, whatever, had been here had simply bled out spontaneously, their life force draining away while they stood upright. Amelia's breathing turned wet and uneven then, each inhale accompanied by a gurgle deep in her throat. She tried to swallow it down, force it back into submission, but it was no use. Panic surged through her veins like wildfire, threatening to consume every rational thought she possessed. She stumbled backwards, hands flailing wildly as she tried to put distance between herself and this place of death. But it was too late. The dragging noise echoed again, louder still, resonating within Amelia's very bones until it felt like her heart would burst from the pressure alone. And then, without warning, everything went black once more. When Amelia came to this time, she found herself lying on the floorboards beneath the window. She could feel something wet and sticky coating her skin, seeping into her clothing, but when she looked down, there was nothing there. No blood, no injury, not even a tear in her fabric. She pushed herself up slowly, eyes scanning the room for any sign of whatever had caused this latest blackout. But there was nothing, just empty space and shadows that seemed to shift menacingly whenever she turned away from them. It took Amelia several attempts before she managed to make it out into the hallway once more, her body feeling like it belonged to someone else entirely. She leaned against the wall for support, sliding down until she was sitting on the floorboards again, knees drawn up to her chest. And that's when she noticed it. The word "stay" carved into the ceiling above her, each letter jagged and uneven as if hacked out by a wild animal rather than a tool designed for such tasks. She'd seen it before, of course, on her first day here, in fact. But now, there was something else too. an undercurrent lurking beneath its surface that she hadn't noticed previously. A command, perhaps, or maybe even a threat. Amelia's mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything that had happened so far. The blood-stained sheets, the teeth found where they shouldn't be, the wet dragging sounds echoing through walls and wardrobes alike. It was almost like there was something living within these walls, something that didn't want her leaving. But what could possibly create such horrors? And why? She shook her head sharply, dislodging those thoughts before they could take root. There had to be a rational explanation for all this. She just hadn't found it yet. Besides, even if there wasn't, even if every instinct screamed at her to run as fast and far away from here as possible, she couldn't leave. Not until she'd gathered enough evidence to prove once and for all whether these rumors were true or not. With grim determination etched onto every line of her face, Amelia pushed herself back up onto her feet once more. She took one last look at the word carved into the ceiling above. Stay, then turned away from it, ready to confront whatever horrors lay waiting in the shadows ahead. But first, she had to find a way out of this house, before it was too late. Amelia's footsteps echoed through the silent house as she made her way back downstairs. The air grew colder with each step, and she could swear she heard whispers carried on the chill breeze, like the ghosts of conversations past. She hugged herself tightly, rubbing her arms briskly to generate some warmth. The kitchen light flickered when she flipped the switch, casting eerie shadows that seemed to writhe across the walls like serpents. She approached the cupboard where she'd found the tooth earlier, her heart pounding in her chest like a trapped animal. It was locked tight, just as she'd left it. But there was something different now. A smear of dried blood across the front, almost blending into the dark wood grain. She traced its sticky texture with her fingertips, feeling a shiver run down her spine at the thought of what could have caused such a mark. It wasn't there before. She was certain of it. And yet here it was, staring back at her like an accusation. Amelia forced herself to move away from the cupboard, her eyes scanning the rest of the kitchen. More blood streaks caught her attention, on the floorboards by the window, leading towards the door that led into the dining room, smeared across the countertop near the sink, almost obscured by dust and grime. Each one seemed to pulse with an inner darkness, drawing her gaze like a morbid magnet. She followed the trail reluctantly, her boots squeaking softly against the sticky floor. The dining room was even colder than the kitchen, and the air felt thick with an unspoken malevolence. A heavy, tarnished mirror hung above the fireplace, its surface reflecting nothing but shadows and distortion. As Amelia approached it, she could have sworn she saw movement within those flickering depths, a shape darting just out of view, too fast to be anything human. She shuddered violently, tearing her gaze away from the mirror. That's when she noticed the teeth. They were scattered across the dining table like some grotesque decoration, their jagged edges glinting malevolently in the dim light. Some still had remnants of flesh clinging to them, while others seemed pristine, as if they'd only just been ripped free from someone's mouth. Amelia reached out cautiously, her fingers brushing against one of the teeth lightly. It was warm, almost feverishly so, and she snatched her hand away in revulsion. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. But there was no denying what lay before her. This was evidence, plain and terrifying. As she stood there, trying to make sense of it all, the wet dragging sound echoed through the walls again, louder this time, closer. It seemed to originate from behind the wallpaper in the hallway, just outside the dining room door. Amelia could see the pattern trembling slightly with each heavy thud, as if something massive was pacing back and forth on the other side. She backed away slowly, her eyes fixed on the wallpaper, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. That's when she heard another sound, a soft, wet cracking noise coming from behind her. She spun around just in time to see one of the dining chairs moving slightly, its legs scraping against the floorboards. The chair seemed to be twitching, like an insect going into spasms before death. Then, with a suddenness that made Amelia gasp aloud, All four legs bent backward at once, their ends digging into the floorboards with soft internal pops. The chair tipped over onto its back, its broken limbs thrashing wildly in mid-air. Amelia stumbled backwards, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This was impossible. Furniture didn't just move like that. And yet here it was, happening right before her eyes, the very definition of reality itself warping around her. She turned to flee, but found herself frozen in place as she heard a new sound: laughter. High-pitched and hysterical, it seemed to echo from every corner of the room at once, bouncing off walls and ceiling until it filled the entire house with its madness. Amelia clapped her hands over her ears, squeezing her eyes shut against the onslaught, but it made no difference. The laughter was inside her now, resonating within her skull like 1,000 tiny hammers. When she opened her eyes again, everything looked different. The colors were too vivid, too harsh, like they'd been painted onto the world with bold strokes of madness. And the angles, they were all wrong, jagged and twisted as if viewed through shattered glass. Panic surged through Amelia's veins, cold and electric, urging her to run, to escape this place before it consumed her completely. But when she tried to move, her body refused to cooperate. Her legs felt heavy, sluggish, like they were mired in deep mud. And her fingers, they began bending backwards slowly, one by one, popping softly with each sickening movement. She screamed then, a raw primal sound torn from the depths of her soul. But even as she did so, Amelia knew it was pointless. No one would hear her here, not in this place where reality had been rent asunder and sanity lay bleeding on the floor. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The laughter faded into silence, the walls stilled, and Amelia's fingers snapped back into their natural position with a final echoing popped. She stood there for several long moments, trembling uncontrollably, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she finally managed to move again, it was only because something within her had broken, some essential thread of humanity that allowed her to push through the horror and keep going. She stumbled out into the hallway, her eyes fixed on the front door like a drowning woman reaching for salvation. But as she approached it, Amelia realized that it too had changed. The once polished wood was now marred by deep scratches, almost like teeth marks. And there, etched into the center of the door, was a single word: leave. It wasn't carved or written. Instead, it seemed to have been formed from countless tiny teeth jammed into the wood, their jagged edges catching the light as they glinted malevolently. Amelia reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against them lightly. They felt sharp, dangerously so. She pulled her hand away quickly, but not before one of the teeth sliced cleanly through her index finger. Blood welled up immediately, dripping down onto the floorboards with steady plops. And as she watched in horrified fascination, those droplets began to crawl along the surface like tiny, crimson spiders, disappearing beneath the door. Amelia staggered back, her breath coming in shallow pants now, her mind teetering on the edge of oblivion. This was too much, too far beyond anything she'd ever experienced or imagined. She needed air. She needed to get out of this house before it drove her completely mad. She turned away from the door, her eyes searching frantically for another way out. That's when she noticed the window at the end of the hallway. It was small, barely large enough for a child to squeeze. Amelia backed away from the door, her breath ragged in her chest, each inhale now accompanied by a wet, sickening sound that seemed to echo within her own body. She felt lightheaded, her vision swimming at the edges, as if reality itself was leaking like an overfilled bathtub. The cut on her finger pulsed with pain, but it was nothing compared to the raw terror clawing its way up her spine. She turned towards the window at the end of the hallway, her movements jerky, uncoordinated. It felt like she was watching herself from a distance, her body moving against her will, propelled by some unseen force. She stumbled forward, each step heavier than the last, as if the very air around her had gained weight and density. The wet dragging sound followed her, growing louder with every step. It seemed to resonate within her bones now, vibrating through her flesh like a second heartbeat, gone awry. She could feel it in her teeth, her molars grinding against each other despite her efforts to keep them clamped shut. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale accompanied by a wet gurgle that made bile rise in the back of her throat. The hallway seemed to stretch out before her, the walls closing in until she was walking through a narrow tunnel of flickering shadows and twisted perspectives. The wallpaper, once charmingly vintage, now appeared to writhe with unseen movement, patterns shifting and changing like a fever dream. She could have sworn she saw teeth grinning at her from behind those fluttering flowers, their jagged edges glinting malevolently in the dim light. Her body felt heavy, sluggish, as if she was wading through deep water or moving through time itself had slowed down to torture her further. Her fingers trembled, curling inward like they wanted to hide from whatever horrors lurked nearby. She could feel them bending backward again, that soft internal pop echoing in her ears like a morbid metronome counting out the seconds until her inevitable descent into madness. But she had to keep moving. Forward was the only direction left to her. There was no turning back now, not with that word carved, or rather built, into the door behind her. Leave, Dachvia. It mocked her, dared her to try and escape. She wouldn't give it the satisfaction of seeing her run. The window loomed ahead, its small size suddenly seeming like an insurmountable obstacle. Amelia reached out for the latch, her fingers brushing against the cold glass pane. It felt damp, almost sticky beneath her touch. She wiped her hand on her clothes before trying again, her heart pounding wildly in her chest as she willed herself not to think about what kind of filth might now be coating her skin. The window creaked open reluctantly, its ancient hinges protesting like the bones of some long-dead creature being dragged unwillingly from its grave. The night air rushed in, carrying with it a scent that made Amelia's stomach heave, wet earth and rotting leaves mixed with something else, something sickly sweet and cloying. It was the smell of decay, but not just any decay. This was the stench of things once alive, now twisted into something unnatural and grotesque. She took a deep breath, trying to fill her lungs with clean air before leaning out of the window. Below her, the ground seemed impossibly far away, the grass beneath it a dark, shifting mass that appeared to writhe like snakes in the moonlight. She could hear them whispering too, those voices from earlier now seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Amelia reached up with both hands, gripping the window frame tightly as she prepared to haul herself out. But her fingers slipped on something wet and sticky, causing her to lose her grip and fall forward with a startled cry. Her head slammed into the wall opposite, stars exploding behind her eyes as pain lanced through her skull. She tasted blood in her mouth, felt it trickling down her face from a cut above her eyebrow. Her vision swam again, everything doubling and tripling, before settling back into place just long enough for her to see what had caused her fall. The window ledge was coated in something thick and dark, almost black in the dim light. It glistened wetly, giving off that same cloying scent as whatever had been rotting outside. And mixed within it were teeth, dozens upon dozens of them, each one gleaming white amidst the filth like perverse pearls strung along a grotesque necklace. Amelia scrambled back from the window, her breath coming in ragged gasps now, each inhale burning her lungs like she'd breathed in fire itself. She could feel something moving inside her mouth, wriggling against her tongue as if trying to escape. Panic surged through her, drowning out every thought except one. Get it out. She stumbled back into the hallway, fingers clawing at her mouth, desperate to dislodge whatever creature had taken up residence there. But when she opened her mouth wide and let out a scream, nothing but air came out. No wriggling thing tumbled forth. Instead, a sharp pain lanced through her jaw, making her cry out again. Her tongue found the source of that pain. Another tooth, loose now, wobbling like a drunken sailor as she ran it along its neighbor's edge. She spat it out onto the floorboards, watching in horrified fascination as it joined the others scattered there already. Her mind flashed back to the dining room, to the teeth strewn across the table like some macabre game of marbles gone wrong. Each one unique, each with a filling or gap that made it impossible to mistake them for anything but what they were. Human teeth torn from their owners' mouths by force unknown. And now, here she was, another victim adding her tooth to the collection. But why? What did these creatures want with them? Amelia stumbled away from the window, her body moving against her will once more, as if pulled along by some unseen puppeteer. She could feel it now, that presence inside her head, whispering softly like a lover's caress gone horribly wrong. It wanted something from her. She just didn't know what yet. She found herself climbing the stairs to the attic, each step echoing through the house like a death knell counting down the seconds until her own demise. The wet dragging sound followed her, growing louder still until it seemed to fill every corner of her being, drowning out all other thoughts except one. It's in here with me. The attic door creaked open reluctantly, revealing a room shrouded in shadows and dust motes dancing like tiny specters in the dim light. Amelia stepped inside, her breath coming in ragged gasps now, each inhale burning her lungs as if she'd been running for miles instead of merely climbing a flight of stairs. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the gloom, revealing a room filled with childhood memories gone wrong. There were dolls huddled together in corners, their once innocent faces now twisted into something cruel and malevolent. Their eyes seemed to follow her as she moved deeper into the room. Amelia's breath caught in her throat as she took in the attic's horrifying tableau. The doll's eyes seemed to bore into her soul, their malicious stares making her skin prickle with dread. She felt like an intruder in this place where time had stopped and innocence decayed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat echoing through her body like a drum roll heralding some impending doom. She could feel it again, that presence pushing at the edges of her mind, urging her forward even as every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn back. The air here was different, heavier somehow, filled with a damp chill that seeped into her bones and made her teeth chatter despite the heat outside. It smelled of dust and decay, like an ancient tomb long forgotten by time. She took a tentative step forward, her foot sinking slightly into the soft attic floorboard. The wet dragging sound seemed to grow louder still, reverberating through the room as if amplified by some infernal device hidden within the walls themselves. It felt invasive now, like fingers stroking along her spine, making her muscles tense and twitch involuntarily. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms hard enough to draw blood. But she barely noticed the pain. All her senses were consumed by that goddamn sound. It was in her head now, filling her ears, vibrating in her teeth. She could taste it, metallic and foul on her tongue. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Silence hung heavy around her like a shroud, broken only by the ragged gasps of her own breath. Each inhale burned her lungs now, turning wet and uneven as if her throat was filling with fluid. She could hear it bubbling there, threatening to choke her at any moment. She stumbled forward again, desperate for air but unable to control her movements. Her body felt like it belonged to someone else now, some unseen force guiding it along its own twisted path. Her fingers bent backward with soft internal pops, joints stretching far beyond their natural limits until they seemed ready to snap completely. She could feel them elongating, becoming more useful. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead as panic surged through her veins like liquid fire. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. Yet here she was, standing in the middle of a godforsaken attic filled with twisted dolls and an unseen presence that seemed intent on consuming her whole. She tried to scream for help, but all that emerged from her lips was a wet gurgle. Her tongue felt thick and sluggish now, filling her mouth until she could barely breathe around it. She reached up with trembling hands, fingers still bent at unnatural angles, and pried open her jaw as wide as it would go. What she saw made bile rise in her throat. Her tongue had swollen to twice its normal size, veins bulging like worms beneath the surface. And there, nestled among them like some grotesque parasite, was another tooth. It wobbled slightly as if eager to join its brethren scattered across the attic floorboards. But this one was different. This one was buried deep within her flesh, embedded so far that even thinking about removing it made her stomach churn with nausea. She could feel it pulsing there, a malevolent heartbeat echoing the rhythm of the wet dragging sound that still echoed through her mind. Her hands flew to her mouth again, fingers clawing desperately at her tongue as she fought against the urge to retch. But it was no use. She couldn't dislodge that tooth any more than she could control her own body. She felt it then, the first tentative probes of whatever creature had taken up residence inside her head. It was testing her, exploring her mind like a blind man reading Braille. She stumbled back, hands pressed against her temples as if trying to physically push away the intruder within. But it was too late for that. She could feel it burrowing deeper now, roots spreading out through her brain like some invasive weed determined to choke out every last vestige of who she'd once been. Her vision swam, doubling and tripling, until everything around her seemed to blur into a kaleidoscope of color and motion. She fell to her knees, hands gripping the floorboards for support, as waves of nausea crashed over her again and again. Her body felt like it was being stretched out on some unseen rack, bones popping and joints shifting, until she could barely recognize herself anymore. And then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. Her breath came back to her in ragged gasps, lungs burning from the effort of drawing air into her chest. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking away tears as she took in her surroundings once more. The attic seemed unchanged, dolls still huddled together in corners, shadows still danced amongst the dust motes floating through the dim light. But something had changed within her, something fundamental and terrifying, because now, when she looked at those dolls, she saw not malice but pleading. Their eyes begged her for something. Their twisted bodies yearned for release from whatever torment held them captive here. She stood on shaky legs, hands still pressed against her temples, as if trying to hold in all the madness threatening to spill out over the edges. She could hear it now, that wet dragging sound again. But this time it came not from within but without. It echoed through the walls surrounding her, vibrating through the very bones of the house itself. And with it came voices, whispers carried on the chill wind blowing in through the open window behind her. They whispered names she didn't recognize, stories she'd never heard before, and yet they felt familiar somehow, as if these were people she knew once, long ago, before all this madness began. She turned slowly towards the sound, heart pounding in her chest like a drum calling warriors to battle. Because that's what this was now. War. A fight for survival against an enemy she couldn't see or understand but knew would consume her whole if given half a chance. And then she saw it, a single tooth lying and gleaming amidst the detritus on the floorboards before her. It was perfect, unbroken, unlike any of the others scattered throughout the house. But there could be no mistaking its origin. It bore the same filling as one of those missing from Amelia's own mouth. She reached down tentatively, fingers trembling as they closed around the tooth. It felt warm in her grasp, almost alive somehow. And then she heard it again, that wet dragging sound growing louder still, until it seemed to fill every corner of her being once more. But this time, something was different. This time, she welcomed it. Because now she knew. It wasn't just after her anymore. It wanted them all. Every last one of those teeth scattered throughout the house belonged to someone who'd passed through these halls before her. Someone who'd felt that same terror, that same helplessness, that same creeping madness. And if Amelia was going to find out what happened here, she needed to follow that sound wherever it led her next, even if it meant losing herself along the way. Amelia descended the creaking staircase, each step echoing like a hammer striking iron in her chest. The air grew colder, heavier with every descent, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down upon her, trying to force her back up again. But she pressed on, driven by an inexplicable compulsion that felt both external and internal, a relentless whisper urging her forward while another screamed at her to flee. The basement door groaned open reluctantly, releasing a gust of stale air laced with something else. Something metallic, earthy, like blood and decay mingled together. She stepped inside, her breath turning wet and uneven, each inhale now echoing with a disturbing gurgle from deep within her throat. Her fingers twitched spasmodically against the doorframe, bending backwards at unnatural angles before snapping back into place with soft, sickening pops. She took another step forward, her foot sinking slightly into something sticky on the floorboards. Looking down, she saw that the dried blood there wasn't hers. It was old, almost black in places, leading off into the darkness like a trail of breadcrumbs left by some deranged creature. Her stomach churned at the sight, bile rising bitterly in her throat as panic clawed its way up from her diaphragm. But she didn't vomit. Instead, she found herself following that trail, drawn along it as if by invisible threads tied around her limbs. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, resonating through the very walls themselves, until they hummed with some ancient, malevolent energy. And then she saw them, names scrawled in blood on the walls, each one accompanied by dates and locations that seemed to dance before her eyes as she tried to focus on them. They were interconnected with lines drawn like spider webs, stretching out in all directions until they formed a vast, terrifying tapestry of human misery. Amelia reached out tentatively, tracing the lines with her fingertips. They felt warm beneath her touch, almost alive, pulsing with some alien rhythm that seemed to syncopate with the throbbing in her own temples. She recognized some of the names, people who'd vanished without trace over the years, their cases left unsolved by indifferent police forces or swallowed whole by the gaping maw of public apathy. But there were others too, names she didn't know, faces she'd never seen. And yet, they felt familiar somehow, like echoes of memories long forgotten, whispers carried on winds that had blown through her mind once upon a time. She heard something then, a faint whispering sound like dry leaves rustling against each other. It seemed to emanate from within the very walls themselves, growing louder until it filled her ears completely, drowning out even the sound of her own ragged breathing. And with it came voices. Whispers carried on the chill wind blowing in through unseen cracks and fissures. They spoke in tongues she didn't understand, languages long dead or perhaps never born. Yet somehow, she comprehended them perfectly. They spoke of pain, of torment, of beings trapped within a prison they couldn't escape nor even begin to comprehend, and they begged for release. Amelia's breath hitched in her throat as realization dawned upon her like a cold shower on naked skin. This wasn't just about missing persons anymore. This was something far darker, far more terrifying than anything she'd ever imagined possible. These names weren't merely victims, they were ingredients. Components within some vast living entity formed from the collective consciousness of those lost souls trapped here within these walls. And now it wanted her too. She could feel its tendrils reaching out towards her, seeking to ensnare her within its web along as had come before. It wanted their teeth, their memories, their identities, anything that would help strengthen itself further against whatever force sought to contain it here. She stumbled back from the wall, hands pressed against her mouth as if trying to hold in all the screams threatening to spill out over the edges. Her eyes darted from side to side, searching desperately for some means of escape, but there was none. This place had been designed specifically to keep its inhabitants trapped forever within its embrace. And then she heard it again, that wet, dragging sound echoing through the walls once more. But this time it seemed louder still, closer somehow, as if whatever made that noise was now right here beside her, hidden just beyond the edge of sight. Amelia turned slowly towards the sound, heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Her fingers bent backwards again, popping audibly as they did so, before she could even register consciously what was happening. They stretched out before her now, elongated into something more akin to talons than hands, their tips glistening wetly with some foul ichor. She looked down at them in horror, watching as those same digits began to twitch spasmodically once more. This time, however, they didn't simply pop back into place afterwards. Instead, they twisted and writhed like snakes until her entire hand was turned entirely backwards, palm facing outwards while her fingers curled towards the ceiling. And still, she couldn't stop herself from moving forward, following that sound despite every fiber of her being screaming at her to flee. Because now she knew it wasn't just after her anymore. It wanted them all. Every last one of those teeth scattered throughout the house belonged to someone who'd passed through these halls before her. And if Amelia was going to find out what happened here, she needed to follow that sound wherever it led her next, even if it meant losing herself along the way, even if it meant becoming just another name etched upon those blood-stained walls, another whisper carried on winds, blowing eternally through these cursed halls. Because now, there could be no turning back. Not for Amelia, not for any of them. They were all trapped here together, bound by unseen chains forged from fear and despair. And until they found a way to break free once and for all, none would ever escape the horror lurking within this suburban home that kept subtly changing. Amelia stood there, hands still pressed against her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief at the sight of her own twisted digits. The wet dragging sound seemed to have receded for now, but its absence did little to alleviate the growing dread coiling around her spine like a serpent. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm herself down enough to think clearly once more. But as she inhaled, something felt wrong. Her breaths were coming too fast, too shallow, as if her lungs could no longer expand properly within their ribcage prison. And there was another sensation too, an unsettling warmth spreading across her chest, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic pulsing that echoed through her entire body like the beating of some alien heart. She looked down at herself, horror dawning in her eyes as she realized what was happening. Her shirt was slowly turning crimson, stained by blood oozing from countless tiny cuts lacerating her skin. They appeared without warning, opening up along the lines of her ribs and sternum, following the same patterns carved into those walls upstairs. Amelia stumbled back against the wall, gasping in pain as she felt fresh blood welling up beneath her fingers. She could hear it now too, a wet, sucking sound echoing from within her own body, each beat of that strange pulse sending more of her life force flowing outwards through those self-inflicted wounds. But even as panic surged through her veins, so too did understanding. This wasn't just about her anymore. Whatever was happening here, it needed Amelia's blood to strengthen itself further against whatever force sought to contain it. She was being used, another ingredient added to the mix in this twisted brew of malevolence. With trembling hands, she grabbed at the hem of her shirt, intent on ripping it off before she bled out entirely. But as she did so, something caught her eye, a name carved into the wall right beside where she'd been leaning. It was her own name, etched deeply into the plaster with letters that seemed to writhe and twist beneath her gaze. Her blood ran cold at the sight of it. How could this be? She hadn't done that, had she? Or was this another symptom of whatever was happening inside her head, another sign that she couldn't trust even her own senses anymore? She stumbled away from the wall, still clutching at her ruined shirt, feeling like a stranger in her own body now. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as if some unseen weight was dragging her downwards towards the floor, forcing her ever closer to those cold, unforgiving stones. And then she heard it again. That wet dragging sound, louder still this time, echoing all around her like thunder from every direction at once. She froze where she stood, listening intently as it seemed to move through the walls themselves, tracking her progress even now despite everything she'd done to try and escape its notice. But there was no escaping it now. Amelia could feel that much clearly enough. This thing, whatever it was, had been waiting for her all along, biding its time until she finally came crawling down here into its lair. And now that she'd arrived, there would be no turning back. A sudden crash echoed through the room behind her, followed by shattering glass cascading onto the floor like 1,000 tiny screams. She spun around just in time to see one of the basement windows exploding inward, shattered remnants flying everywhere. But there was no wind blowing outside tonight, nothing at all except for an ominous stillness that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Amelia stood rooted to the spot, watching helplessly as more windows began to shatter around her. One by one they exploded into fragments, each impact sending fresh waves of terror coursing through her veins. And then, amidst the chaos, she saw something moving outside, a dark shape writhing against the night sky before slithering away once more. But it wasn't just some random shadow. No, this was something far worse than that, because as Amelia watched in horrified fascination, she realized what she'd seen. Teeth, rows upon rows of them, grinning maniacally at her through the darkness before disappearing entirely back into the night. She stumbled backwards, hands flying up to cover her mouth once more, eyes wide with terror and disbelief. Those weren't just any teeth. They belonged to faces she knew all too well now, each one bearing witness to horrors beyond comprehension within these very walls. And now those same faces seemed intent on gaining entrance once more. A sudden gust of wind swept through the basement then, cold and biting like the touch of death itself. It seemed to carry whispers with it too, voices clamoring for release, their words spoken in tongues long forgotten by man, but somehow familiar nonetheless. They echoed around her now, pressing against Amelia's ears until she could no longer hear even her own breath over their collective screams. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the wind stopped. The whispers fell silent too, leaving behind nothing but an oppressive stillness that seemed to weigh heavily upon Amelia's shoulders. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, barely daring to breathe, let alone move again. But she knew she couldn't stay here forever. Eventually something would force her out into the open once more. And so, with trembling hands and legs that felt like lead weights, Amelia turned towards the stairs leading back up into the house proper. That's when she noticed it. The door at the top of those steps had been slammed shut tight against her approach. But worse still was what was written across its surface in blood-red letters, gleaming malevolently through the gloom. Trapped. She stared at that word for a long moment, feeling all hope drain away like sand through an hourglass. This wasn't just about being trapped physically anymore. No, this was something far more insidious than that. For in seeing those letters carved into the door, Amelia finally understood the true nature of her predicament. She was trapped not merely within these walls, but also within herself now, bound by unseen chains, forged from fear and despair. And until she found a way to break free once and for all, both mentally and physically, none would ever escape the horror lurking within this suburban home that kept subtly changing around her. Because now there could be no turning back. Not for Amelia, not for any of them. They were all trapped here together, bound by unseen chains forged from fear and despair. And until they found a way to break free once and for all, none would ever escape the horror lurking within this suburban home that kept subtly changing around her. But as she took those first tentative steps back up towards the door, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed deep down inside herself too, as if some vital part of her being had been irrevocably altered by everything she'd witnessed here tonight. And in that moment, standing alone amidst the shattered remnants of her sanity, she finally understood what it meant to truly lose oneself within the grasp of such malevolent forces as these. For now there was no longer any doubt left inside Amelia's mind. She knew without question who, or rather what, had been calling out to her through those whispers. Amelia backed away from the door, her eyes flicking between the blood-red letters and the shadows that seemed to have grown darker still since she'd last looked upon them. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps now, each one accompanied by a wet sound that made her stomach churn with revulsion. She could feel it too, deep down inside herself, that same unsettling warmth from earlier, spreading across her chest like tendrils of flame. But there was no time to worry about any of that now, not when the very air around her seemed alive with malevolence, pressing in on all sides as if intent on crushing her entirely. She had to keep moving forward, keep pushing onwards towards whatever lay beyond those stairs leading up into the house proper. And so she did, each step feeling heavier than the last, as though some unseen force sought to hold her back at every turn. But Amelia refused to yield, refused to succumb to fear or despair any longer. For she knew now what awaited her here within these walls. Not just death, perhaps, but something far worse besides. For in those moments alone, amidst the shattered remnants of her sanity, Amelia had finally come face to face with the truth lurking behind all this horror. She understood now why none before her had ever escaped alive, why every attempt at rescue or investigation had ended in failure and tragedy instead. Because this thing, this collective mind built from missing people, it wasn't trapped here at all. No, quite the contrary in fact, for it was they who were trapped, all of them, bound by unseen chains forged from fear and despair within its grasp forevermore. And until someone found a way to break free once and for all, none would ever escape the horror lurking within this suburban home that kept subtly changing around them. As Amelia reached the top step, she paused briefly to steel herself before pushing open the door leading into the kitchen beyond. The room was shrouded in darkness, save for a single sliver of moonlight, cutting through the gloom like a blade, casting stark shadows upon every surface it touched. But there was something else too, something far more disturbing than mere lack of light. For standing before her now, blocking off her only means of escape, stood what appeared to be an enormous writhing mass of human limbs and features, each one different yet eerily familiar somehow. Tendrils of flesh burst forth from every wall, floor, ceiling, seemingly coalescing together into this monstrous form which towered above her menacingly. Amelia stumbled backwards in shock, her heart pounding wildly within its cage as she tried desperately to make sense of what she was seeing. But there was no rational explanation for such a sight, none that could possibly explain away the sheer horror of it all anyway, because this wasn't just some illusion or trick of the light either. Oh no, this was something far more real than anything she'd ever encountered before. And then she realized, those whispers, those teeth she'd found earlier where they shouldn't have been, they weren't hers at all but belonged instead to this thing looming before her now. For it had been calling out to her through them all along, guiding her ever closer towards its waiting grasp. A cold chill ran down Amelia's spine as she understood the full extent of her predicament then. This entity wasn't merely feeding off her blood anymore. No, now it wanted something else entirely from her too. Something far more precious than mere bodily fluids could ever be. It wanted her identity. Her very soul, perhaps even. And with that realization came another. The knowledge that she couldn't allow such a thing to happen. Not again. Not after everything she'd already endured here within these walls. Because if this entity succeeded in consuming her essence completely, then there would truly be no hope left for any of them ever again. But how could she fight something like this? How could one lone woman possibly hope to stand against such a foe when others far stronger than herself had fallen before it already? Yet despite all logical reasons screaming at her to turn tail and flee, Amelia found herself taking another step forward instead. Then another after that, until she stood mere inches away from the pulsating mass of flesh before her now. She could feel its heat radiating against her skin, like some unholy fire. Hear the wet sounds issuing forth from within it, as though countless mouths whispered secrets just beyond her comprehension. And still she stood there, unmoving despite every fiber of her being crying out for flight instead. For Amelia knew deep down inside herself that this was it, the moment when everything would either come crashing down around her, or else be lifted up towards salvation at last. There could be no turning back now, not after everything she'd seen, done, felt here within these walls. As if sensing her resolve strengthening, the entity seemed to shift before her then, its tendrils writhing and coiling like snakes preparing to strike. Amelia steeled herself once more, taking a deep breath, only to gag instantly upon inhaling something foul and putrid that threatened to overwhelm her senses entirely. But she refused to back down, refused to yield even an inch now after coming so far already. Instead, she reached out with trembling hands, allowing her fingers to brush against the pulsating flesh before her. It felt slick and warm beneath her touch, almost wet somehow, as though countless bodies had been melded together here into one monstrous form instead of simply being absorbed by it over time. And then something else happened. A sensation, unlike anything she'd ever experienced before, began coursing through her veins, starting at the point where her skin met the entity's and spreading rapidly outward from there. It was like fire burning deep within her marrow, but cold too somehow. Ice and flame intertwined together in some maddening dance designed solely to drive her insane. But even amidst such torment, Amelia refused to let go, refused to break contact until she had learned everything there was to know about this creature looming before her now. Because despite all appearances otherwise, she knew deep down inside herself that it wasn't truly alive after all. Not in any sense most people would recognize anyway. No, what stood before her here today was something far more insidious than mere life could ever hope to be. A collective consciousness born from the shattered remnants of those who'd gone missing within these very Amelia's fingers curled inward like dying roots, the joints popping softly as they bent backward at unnatural angles. She felt it then, the entity's cold fire surging up her arms, into her chest, a glacier melting within her veins. Her breath caught in her throat, wet and ragged, each inhale drawing the corruption deeper. Blood crusted like rust on the walls around her, places she knew she'd never been before. Yet here it was, dried and flaking, as if the very air had been contaminated by its presence. The realization sent a shockwave of panic through her, but it was too late. She was already drowning in the collective mind's grip. She tried to pull away, her hands now grotesque parodies of their former selves, fingers fused into stiff claws. But the entity held firm, tendrils coiling around her wrists like iron manacles. It whispered through her mind, a chorus of lost souls crying out for union, for absorption. Their voices echoed within her skull, drowning out rational thought. Her vision swam, doubling over as she saw herself standing there, trapped and trembling, while another version of Amelia approached from behind. This doppelganger reached out, placing her hands on Amelia's shoulders, and began to squeeze, not in anger or malice, but with gentle insistence, guiding her forward into the writhing mass. The entity pulsed once, then twice, like a heartbeat, accelerating. It was happening. She could feel it now, the collective mind stretching wide to consume her whole. Panic surged through her, raw and visceral, but there was nowhere left to run. She was already lost within its embrace. Amelia screamed, a sound torn from her very soul, yet even that was absorbed into the entity's formless maw. Her body convulsed, fingers twisting further until they snapped like dry twigs. Blood bloomed beneath her skin, veins bulging black against pallid flesh as if ink had been injected directly into her arteries. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The entity released her, tendrils retracting back into its formless core. Amelia stood there for a moment longer, breathing raggedly, before collapsing to the floor in a heap of broken limbs and violated flesh. She was alive, but not quite herself anymore. Her fingers twitched spasmodically, bones knitting back together at angles slightly askew. She felt it then, the cold dread seeping into her bones. The entity hadn't absorbed her identity, it had relocated itself within her. As darkness claimed her vision, Amelia realized the true horror of their encounter. The entity wasn't trapped here anymore because it didn't need to be. It was everywhere now, inside every breath she took, every beat of her heart. And there was nothing left for her to do but scream into the abyss that had once been her mind. But no sound came out, just silence. Endless, deafening silence. Amelia awoke with a start, gasping for air as if she'd been held underwater too long. Her body felt heavy, sluggish, like it belonged to someone else entirely. She pushed herself up from the cold floor, her hands leaving bloody prints behind on the dusty surface. The room was empty, save for the echoes of her past screams reverberating off the walls. The entity was gone, its pulsating mass absorbed back into the shadows whence it came. or so she thought. Until she noticed something peculiar, a thin, vein-like trace of darkness running along one wall, snaking up towards the ceiling before disappearing into the gloom above. She approached cautiously, heart pounding in her chest like a drum roll heralding some impending doom. As she reached out to touch the mark, it seemed to writhe beneath her fingertips, pulsing with an eerie life of its own. A chill ran down her spine as understanding dawned on her. This wasn't just residue. It was the entity's trail, its essence seeping into the very fabric of the building. Amelia stumbled back, horror-struck. She thought she could contain it here, trap it within these walls, until someone else stumbled upon their shared fate and destroyed whatever remained of it. But now, there was no telling where the creature might have spread next. She ran then, fleeing through the labyrinthine halls of the old asylum, pursuing the dark vein as it snaked along walls and across ceilings like some twisted, living moral. The building seemed endless, its corridors stretching out before her in maddening futility, until she realized that she was no longer chasing the entity, but rather being led deeper into its heart. Finally, Amelia found herself standing before a door she'd never seen before, or perhaps one she simply couldn't remember having passed through previously. The darkness pulsed beneath her touch once more, inviting her inside. She hesitated, knowing full well what awaited her on the other side, yet unable to resist the call nonetheless. The room within was bathed in shadows cast by a single flickering light bulb suspended from the ceiling by a length of frayed wire. In its center stood an old cot, its once white sheets now stained yellow with age and something else entirely. And upon that cot lay Amelia. Her doppelganger stared back at her, eyes wide and unblinking. Skin stretched taut over hollow cheeks, but there was no malice in those eyes, no hunger either. Instead, they held a silent plea for release from the torment she'd been subjected to since their minds had first entwined. Amelia approached cautiously, reaching out to touch her other self's forehead. It felt cold beneath her fingers, like marble instead of flesh. As she withdrew her hand, she noticed something peculiar. The vein of darkness had disappeared entirely, absorbed completely into Amelia's own body now. And then it happened. The room began to shake violently, walls crumbling around them as the entity's power surged within both their forms simultaneously. Amelia watched in horror as her doppelganger's body contorted grotesquely, bones breaking and reforming at unnatural angles until it bore no resemblance whatsoever to humanity anymore. When finally the convulsions ceased, the creature before her opened its eyes that were now entirely black, without pupil or iris, mere voids staring out into the world. Amelia leaned closer as the creature's mouth opened. At first, no sound came, just movement. Rows of teeth shifting against one another, grinding softly like stone dragged across bone. The black pits where its eyes should have been locked onto her, unblinking, unmerciful. Then, it spoke. But the voice that came out was not the creature's. It was hers. Not similar, not distorted. Perfect. Her own voice, delivered from a throat that no longer belonged to her. I waited, it whispered. Amelia staggered backward, shaking her head violently. No, she rasped. No, that isn't. But the words faltered as something cold slid along the inside of her jaw. Movement. Inside her mouth. She gagged, clawing at her throat as the sensation deepened, not choking, not suffocating, growing. Her tongue spasmed. Her teeth ached. One by one, pressure bloomed along her gums, deep and unbearable, like something forcing its way upward from beneath the bone. Her knees buckled. She fell forward, catching herself against the edge of the cot where her other self lay. And then, crack, doddo. A tooth broke free. Not outward. Inward. Sliding down her throat. She screamed, or tried to, but the sound never left her mouth. Instead, something else did. A whisper. Not spoken. Released. A voice passed through her lungs that did not belong to her alone. Hundreds layered beneath it. Thousands. A chorus of breathless remnants. Lost names. Forgotten mouths. She collapsed fully to the floor, clutching her chest as the pressure spread deeper, ribs tightening, lungs constricting, heart stuttering under the growing weight inside her. Memories surged next. Not hers. Not entirely. Faces she had never seen flashed behind her eyes. Men, women, children, their mouths opening in silent screams as their teeth were torn free, their voices swallowed into the dark. And now, they were speaking through her. Not one voice. All of them. The creature stepped forward. No, not stepped. Merged. Its flesh unraveled into thin, pulsing threads that slid across the floor toward her, weaving into her arms, her throat, her spine. Cold. Wet duct. Permanent. Her body arched violently as the last of it entered her chest. And then, stillness. Complete. Unnatural. Amelia rose slowly from the floor. Too slowly. Too smoothly. Like a puppet pulled upright by invisible strings. Her head tilted to one side with a soft, wet pop. Her mouth opened. And this time, the voice came easily. Clear. Control. Perfectly steady. We were trapped, she said. But the words echoed wrong. Layered. Stacked. Not one voice. Many. Her reflection shifted in the flickering light, not splitting, not multiplying, but deepening, as if countless unseen faces pressed just beneath her skin, waiting their turn to speak. Her fingers flexed. Backward. Forward. Testing. Learning. Adapting. Understanding. And then she smiled. Not out of relief. Not out of victory. But recognition. Because now she understood what the others had become. What they had always been. Not victims. Not ghosts. Messengers. Carriers. Voices. Her throat tightened once more, but not in pain. In readiness. Something moved deep within her chest, gathering itself like breath before speech. Preparing. Waiting. And when she spoke again, it was no longer Amelia Hart speaking. It was all of them. All at once. All forever. I am the entity's voice now.